to start us. My presentation is going to kind of be over the challenges and successes that we've had with the bird conservation programs that we participate in Hawaii. So who are we? The Hawaii Endangered Bird Conservation Center is a cooperative partnership between the San Diego Zoo Global, like the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, the U.S. government. We're a nonprofit organization, and we've been working with breeding endangered birds in Hawaii for about 25 years now. So this is just going to be like a summary of what we've done. So the HEBCP consists of two different breeding facilities. So we have two facilities, one on the island of Maui and one on the Big Island, Hawaii. So both facilities, we both maintain the exact same species, and we do that basically to ensure that we can maintain the genetic diversity of the species that we work with, just because there are lots of natural disasters that can occur and can affect the bird populations that we hold. So these are the islands of Hawaii. So Hawaii is located out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. It's about 1,800 kilometers from the United States mainland. So it's a good distance from land. The main islands that you'll hear me talking about are Kauai, right up here. We work with some species there. Maui is here. We work with a species there. And then this is the big island, Hawaii, and we work with a couple species located on that island as well. So the biggest factors that are affecting the birds of Hawaii are introduction of native species. And so our ungulates, they destroy the habitat, eliminate any resources that the birds would be using to nest and to feed on. We have over 60 different introduced bird species on the island that compete for resources with the native birds. Of course, we have our predators. We have the mongoose, which was introduced to eat the rats, but it turns out that the mongoose are diurnal and the rats are nocturnal, so that didn't work out that well. We just have more predators. Next, we have lots of invasive plants. So a lot of the habitat, as the ungulates remove the native plants grow very slowly. When they were evolving, they just didn't adapt to having any animals eating on those plants. And so the invasive plant species take over very quickly. So it's really hard to maintain native habitat. And last but not least, this is a big one that's affecting the birds more than any of the other ones. The other ones have occurred in the past. The introduction of the mosquitoes affecting the bird populations the most greatly right now. So the mosquito was introduced probably in the late 1800s, and they carry avian malaria and avian pox. And all of the birds on the islands of Hawaii, they don't have an immune system for avian malaria. And so basically the native bird populations are being forced to live above the mosquito line, which is about 1,400 meters. And so the native wildlife used to go all the way down to the coastline, but now it's being maintained up at the higher elevations. On like the island of Kauai, the species on that island, the mosquito elevation line is actually about 5,000 feet. So the birds there are going to be losing their entire habitat to mosquitoes within the next 5 years. So that species is anticipated to go extinct when that does happen. So on the island of Hawaii, it's an active volcano on that island. So just this past summer, the volcano was erupting, and it was erupting for probably about 3 months, actively erupting. And it took out quite a bit of habitat that the birds naturally use. With global warming, hurricanes are becoming more of an issue. They come in and drop a lot of rain, which causes a lot of flooding, and that does affect nesting success during the breeding season. And then, of course, fires and habitat destruction. So when it comes to conservation breeding, the conservation breeding is kind of a last-ditch effort after all of the other resources have been attempted with little or no success. So a lot of the species that we worked with, habitat restorations occurred, like translocations have occurred, just lots of observations to try to determine what has happened with those bird populations. And there's been no result of those observations. So how do we determine what species we work with? On each island, there's a field team that usually consists of about 4 to 5 people, and they do constant monitoring of like bird nests in the wild. They do annual bird counts to determine populations, and just kind of monitor the data that they do collect. So at the end of the breeding seasons, they'll usually analyze any data that was collected, and if they do notice trends of decline, usually someone on those field teams will bring that to the attention of the state, and then they can discuss future conservation measures that need to be taken. So for the most part, we only really focus on breeding populations that start to take very sharp declines. So the principles of using the captive breeding for species recovery programs is to increase the productivity of each bird. So we can basically double or triple clutch the birds where they can lay a certain number of eggs. We'll just pull those eggs, artificially incubate them, and hand rear any chicks and just get those birds to lay as many eggs during a season as we can. So if we have a release that is coming on quickly, we can really increase production of chicks. For the most part, if a release isn't scheduled to be happening, we usually don't hatch a lot of chicks because that means we have to house those chicks in captivity, and that does take a lot of resources and money to do that. So at our 2 facilities, we are currently holding about 200 birds of 5 different species. So later in this presentation, I'll be talking about those successes and failures of those species. So other things that is a benefit of having a captive breeding program is we can closely monitor the birds, we can prevent disease, and so we can greatly reduce mortality and increase the longevity of the bird, so we can get more breeding seasons out of each individual bird. When it comes to the releases, we can release birds into protected areas where habitat restoration's been occurring. We can use these birds to augment smaller populations to give them a good boost. And we can also establish new populations in different areas of the islands where lots of native habitat restoration's been occurring. So where do we get our birds from? So when it comes to collecting birds, we actually don't take very many adult birds from the wild. We'll typically collect the eggs out of the nests. So this has a couple factors. So when we harvest wild eggs, this minimizes or completely eliminates quarantine issues of bringing the birds into captivity. Like we consider an egg to be a healthy individual with little to no disease because they're protected inside the egg. The birds that are raised in captivity from a young age are basically transitioned to a captive diet very quickly. That's basically the only diet that they know. And so we can maintain their health very well and reduce stress with each individual. And then this also minimizes the impact on the wild population. So we're just taking eggs and the chicks from the nest. The birds will go back to nesting, and basically the population will be increasing each year because they've produced chicks in the nest, and we've also gotten a couple chicks back in our captive facilities. So when it comes to the captive breeding program, we closely monitor any genetics with the breeding individuals. So each species and each population is very different with how many birds we're able to start with. So the alala population, it was a very small number when compared to our akikiki population, which was a much larger number at about 44 individuals. So when we're analyzing genetics, we're looking at just inbreeding coefficients, and we manage those numbers through the PopLink stud book program and PM 2000 also. So when it comes to pairing the birds, instead of just throwing 2 birds together and hoping for the best, even if they are like the best genetically managed pairs, we always try to give each bird a choice of a mate. Just because when they're allowed to choose their mate, this can increase fertility and increase chick reproduction. So some things that we've seen with effects of inbreeding, are like just poor egg quality, infertility of the egg, malpositions of the chick in the egg, and just infertility altogether. So the alala, that's one of our main species that we work with. So this is an adult alala here. And so this is an example of an eye issue that is a genetic factor, and it's missing its nictitating membrane. And so we have lots of eye issues within our alala population. And so any birds that have a missing nictitating membrane, we consider them non-release birds. And so then we're just kind of stuck holding them in captivity, and they're kind of basically taking up space from breeding individuals. And this is just some of the common malformations that we see with alala chicks. You can kind of see that the beak is crossed there. This particular chick's actually missing its eye in there. It's kind of sunken in. So this is a pretty common problem. We probably see it about 4 out of 50 eggs in a breeding season. So we closely monitor what issues do arise, and we're trying to analyze the genetic material and identify the exact gene which causes these malformations. So when it comes to the birds of Hawaii, there's about 50 species that are endemic to Hawaii, and you'll see up here, a good majority of those birds have already become extinct. Just each time people arrive on the island, there's usually mass extinctions, and then just over the years, more and more birds have gone extinct. So the majority of our birds that are currently living right in here are endangered or vulnerable. There's just a few species that aren't threatened, and those species are typically larger species found down in wetland areas on each island. So you'll see up here this family Drepanodidae. This is the Hawaiian honeycreepers, so this is a large part of the species that we work with. So all of these birds evolved from one particular bird that arrived on the island like millions of years ago, and that was the Eurasian rosefinch. So you can see in this picture here just all the diversity that has occurred within all of the honeycreepers on the island. So all of the birds that have a red circle around them, these are all species that have gone extinct. The most recent species that went extinct was this one right down here, the po'ouli, and it went extinct in 2004. So we started bringing birds into captivity because they identified that there was a problem late 2003. They knew of 3 individuals in the wild. They caught one and they never saw any others. So he eventually died at our facility in Maui. But that's kind of an example of we want to be proactive and not let populations to get too small. We need to take action as soon as we notice there's issues occurring. So when it comes to working with the birds in captivity, with the critically endangered birds, we don't want to just capture them, bring them into captivity and learn how to take care of them. So we'll typically collect different species that are similar in the habitat use and adaptations. So these are just some model species that we have had in our facilities over time, and they're closely related to species that we have worked with and did conservation work or are currently working with. So these next birds that I'll be discussing are basically the birds that have developed our program. So the first couple birds that really started our program were the nene and the alala. So back in the 1950s, the nene population got down to about 30 birds. And the nene is an important bird because it is the state bird of Hawaii. It's a larger bird. So it's known by many people worldwide, really. So it's endemic to all of the Hawaiian Islands. We started working with this species back in the late 80s. And between 1997 and 2011, we released 396 goslings back into the islands of the... the next line, we have 442 nene released on the island, so that difference in numbers is attributed to a collection of eggs from nests. So the main predator of the nene is the mongoose. So the mongoose will actually kill the adult birds while they're incubating the eggs, and so there's biologists in the field that closely monitor any nests, and if an adult bird is killed on the nest, the eggs are collected, they're hatched out, and then those birds can be released back into the wild. So today the population is about 3,000 birds, so the population has grown a lot in just 50 years or so. So the partners are continuing to work every breeding season, making sure that the predators are under control and the survival of the chicks is well maintained. So the puaiohi, this is a bird that we worked with for many years. It's endemic to the island of Kauai. And its population was fairly stable, but this species doesn't necessarily meet the description of what I said before, where we focus on working with species that are in decline. But we wanted to see if we could help this bird and just kind of give it a boost in its native range. So we started working with this species back in the mid-90s, and you can see as the years go by, there's a huge increase in the number of birds currently in the wild. So with this species, between 1996 and 2012, we released 222 puaiohi back into the wild. And the majority of those birds survived and went on to reproduce. And that's a big factor in the growth of the bird population. So here's a picture of the alala. So I mentioned this a little bit earlier. So the alala is the Hawaiian crow, and it's endemic to the big island of Hawaii. It actually went extinct in 2002, and they started noticing the trends like back in the late 70s that the population was declining. They didn't really know a lot about the crow, and so they started to research it. Even today, we don't have a lot of documentations of how this bird lived in the wild, so we're constantly learning new things about this bird as we take care of it. So this population actually got down to about 20 birds in captivity in the wild. So with this population, there's only 9 founders. So the entire population is based on just those 9 birds. And of those 9 birds, only 8 of them have reproduced to produce lots of offspring. So the majority of these offspring are highly inbred. So since 1993, we've hatched 267 alala. So currently, there's 146 alala basically in the world. At our Keaho Bird Conservation Center on the Big Island, they hold 80 birds. At the Maui Bird Conservation Center, we hold 40 birds. And we just started to release alala back into the wild 3 years ago. Our first release didn't go as well as we expected. We released 5 birds, and within 3 days, 3 of those birds were dead. And so we brought the 2 remaining birds back into captivity and kind of evaluated our release efforts. And we determined that these birds needed a little bit more age on them, because when we released them, they were only about 8 months old. And so we let them grow up a little bit more, kind of learn more about the world. And we also did anti-predator training, because the Hawaiian hawk got 2 of the birds. And so we wanted to make sure that they knew where the predators were and that predators did exist. And so a year later, we released another 11, and they actually learned a lot from the anti-predator training, and within the first few weeks of being released, they were seen mobbing EO and the Hawaiian hawk and chasing them out of the area. And so pretty much for the entire year up to this past September, all 11 of those birds were surviving. So this past September, we released another 11 birds a couple miles away from the initial release site. And within just a couple days, all of the birds were in one big group. So the older birds went to check out the young birds. And they're all still living well together. The alala, they start reproducing at 4 years of age. And so they're just reaching their breeding age. So we're hoping that this upcoming breeding season we'll have some alala hatching in the wild. So there's currently 2 pairs that have paired up, created territories, and are playing with nesting material in anticipation of a breeding season that will be starting probably in about a month or so. So these birds are very territorial when they are an adult bird. So their territory is about 2 square kilometers, so it's a pretty good sized space. So the 2 pairs that have paired up, they are chasing birds out of the release area. So one problem that we are facing is we're releasing young birds. They're all getting along great, but then as they mature, they're pairing up and forming territories. So the area that we're saying can hold this many birds probably actually can't hold as many birds as we're releasing, and so those birds will have to distribute to what we hope is good habitat. Habitat is somewhat limited. The alala, they're more of a frugivore crow. They will eat some nestlings and nests, but they don't actively hunt birds, and they don't eat much carrion like some other corvid species. So this picture here, this is from 2011. We had like 19 chicks that year, so this is just a representation of all the different age groups that we kind of work with. So in the past, when our numbers were very low, so we basically had about 9 birds, the main focus was increasing the number of surviving alala in the wild. We filled up all of our holding space for alala, so basically to house one alala, it costs about $50,000 to build a space for them. They do require quite a bit of space. They're a fairly large bird. The average weight of an alala is about 500 grams. And so today, basically that 120 birds that we're holding in captivity, that's filling all of our space. And so we don't necessarily need to increase the numbers more than what we are currently holding. Our new focus is releasing birds into suitable habitat. So instead of just hatching 20 to 30 birds each season, we're focused on getting our birds comfortable and well experienced with parent rearing. So up until 3 years ago, all alala that were hatched were hand raised. And basically there's 7 generations of alala that haven't had the opportunity to raise chicks. And so we're allowing the birds to learn how to be parents. And this is basically a plan put in place because if we can get birds to build a nest, lay eggs, incubate eggs, and hatch them all on their own without human intervention, those will be great candidates to release back into the wild. So like to date, we just have juvenile birds out in the wild, so we don't actually know that they are going to reproduce or what's going to happen with those birds. So if we can get proven pairs released into the wild, there's a great chance that we could get birds to start breeding in the wild. So another species that we work with is the peligro, or the Hawaiian finch-billed honeycreeper. So this species is endemic to the Big Island, and it's just one large population. It's about 800 to 1,000 birds. There were great declines with this species, and a big part of that was habitat and the vegetation that's available to those birds. So this plant that is right in here, this is a mamane tree, and it's very unique as it's a toxic plant to pretty much all animals, but the peligro has adapted to eat the seed pods off of it. So because it's a toxic plant, the ranchers decided that they didn't want any mamane on their land, and so they removed all the mamane for their hoof stock, and this basically eliminated suitable habitat for the peligro. So in the late 2000s, there was actually a court case where the government was sued to provide habitat to the peligro, and so they did fence off a large section of land, and they planted the mamane plants for these birds. So over like the last 15 to 20 years, those mamane plants have been growing and becoming more and more established. So whenever we do habitat restoration, we need probably about 25 years to have the minimum standards for a quality habitat. We probably need even longer than that, but we don't have a lot of time to just allow the plants to grow up. So we're actually going to be doing a release with peligro this spring. We'll be releasing 32 different individuals into a new habitat area, starting a new population, and then we'll be radio tracking these birds, kind of seeing how they use the habitat, if the habitat's suitable for them. And if everything goes well, we'll be translocating birds over the next 3 years to this new habitat. And we're going to try to start this new population. It's on the other slope of Mauna Kea. That's a mountain that's there. And it's actually on the wetter side of the slope. Where the population currently is, it's a very dry side. With global warming, we're concerned that the habitat will become unsuitable as it continues to increase in temperature. And so we just want to make sure we can identify a suitable habitat for the peligro to maintain their population. So between 1996 and 2018, we've hatched 142 chicks, and we've released 28 peligro over a 7-year period. Back in the early 2000s, there was actually a drought occurring during after that 7-year period, and a lot of those individuals, especially the translocated individuals, they just flew back to their where they were captured. And the captive birds that were released there, a lot of them continued to breed there until the conditions just became unsuitable and they eventually died. Another species that we work with is the kiwikiu. So this is the Maui parrotbill. So this is a population, it's a very stable population, but the main thought with this population is if we can increase the suitable habitat, this bird will expand its population size. So right now it's one subpopulation. We're going to try to be creating like corridors similar to what's been mentioned for the finch here. So the Maui parrotbill, they feed mostly on insects. So as we're doing habitat restoration, we need to make sure that the insects that go along with the ecology of that environment are also present. You can plant all the plants you want, but if the food source isn't with the plants, it doesn't have much no positive factors for the bird populations. So this species, they're a very calm species in captivity, but for some reason they've turned out to be a very difficult species to breed. Over the last 20 years, we've only hatched 20 chicks. So the kiwikiu, they actually only lay one nest during the breeding season. If they are successful in raising a chick, that chick remains with them for 18 months. So it's a very long parental care period as well. And so those are two factors that affect breeding success. I think a big part of our issues with this bird is a proper diet. So we currently have no longer have breeding females, and so we can't continue to research what could be inhibiting breeding success. So because we have no suitable females for breeding, we're actually going to be releasing all the birds that we currently hold into a new habitat this upcoming October, and we're going to be translocating 12 birds along with those. So of those 20 birds that we're going to be moving, the idea is to do a soft release and have a captive bird next to a translocated bird. And the captive bird will basically be teaching the translocated bird where the food sources are, kind of assist them in learning more about how to use the feeders that will be provided for the birds. And then once the birds are released, they'll be held in the release aviaries for 2 weeks, and then they'll be released. And the idea is once they are released, then the translocated bird will kind of teach the captive bird how to find the food, where the best habitat would be, and they'll just kind of follow each other through the habitat. So this habitat that we're going to be releasing at, they've been doing habitat restoration there for the last 20 years. So this is a 90-hectare area that they've fenced off. They've removed all of the ungulates from that area. We still have predators, but the habitat is coming back slowly. So a lot of the trees that have been planted, even like 10 years ago, they're only about 6 to 8 feet tall. So they do provide habitat, it's just not necessarily the best habitat. So there are areas that are more developed, and we're just hoping that the birds can use the less developed areas as the corridors to the more defined habitats. So these last two species that we're going to work with, these are our most recent species that we started to work with, and we started working with them in 2015. In 2010, these species were considered to be endangered. They were put on the endangered species list. Today, the akikiki population is estimated to be probably around 300 birds. The population just continues to decline very rapidly. So the next bird and this bird that I'm talking about, they come from Kauai. So this is that island that I was talking about where the mosquitoes are basically moving higher and higher up the mountain range, and the akikiki and the akike'e will no longer have any suitable habitat that isn't affected by the mosquitoes. So when birds are exposed to the avian malaria, within a couple weeks, they will end up dying. So birds are slowly becoming immune to the avian malaria, but there's just not enough time for them to fully do that all by themselves. So there's probably about 10% of the wild population that does have the antibodies for the avian malaria, but if you consider 10% of like 250, it's not very many birds. So we're bringing akakiki and akake'e into captivity, and our thought is to basically make as big of a population in captivity as we can. And we're anticipating that this bird will be going extinct in the next 5 years. And so when they do go extinct, we'll have plenty of birds in captivity with a representation of the gene diversity from the wild birds. So all of the akakiki that we have, they were all collected as eggs from the wild. So we collected 64 eggs. 46 of those individuals are living today. The akakiki doesn't start reproducing until they're 2 years old. So we started collecting eggs in 2015. In 2015, we collected we hatched 11 chicks, and only one female hatched out of those 11 birds. And so we've kind of had a skewed population. Today we have 19 breeding females, but a lot of those females, they're just becoming of breeding age this upcoming season. So we're anticipating a big year for breeding these. We have hatched 3 akakiki at MBCC this past year. So those are 3 individuals that were basically hatched for the first time in captivity. So that's pretty exciting. So this last bird is the akake'e. So this is also endemic to Kauai. This bird, its populations are a little bit larger than the akakiki population, but it's still declining very rapidly. The idea was to create basically a population of 50 akakiki and 50 akake'e, but when it came to collecting the eggs from the wild, the akakiki nests were very easy to find, that their ranges for those birds was quite small, and so they basically identified birds, tracked it back to the nest, and then had a nest to collect eggs from. With the akake'e, their territory is about 4 times larger than the akakiki, and the field crews had a very difficult time following a bird back to the nest. And so, since 2015, only 27 eggs have been collected versus that 63 that we collected for the akakiki. And only 10 individuals are living today. So with this species feeds more of catching live prey on the wing. And so they just don't seem to be adapting to captivity as well as we'd like them to. They're constantly hanging on the wire. They just seem like a very stressed bird compared to the akakiki. We do have a pair of akake'e currently building a nest. She just started building their nest a couple days ago. So we'll see what happens with them. We're not planning on doing any more egg collections. So when it comes to the akake'e, these 10 individuals that we have, we'll do what we can with them. But the hope is that relatively soon we'll do a translocation and move a lot of those birds from Kauai to another island that has a higher elevation that they can kind of support the akake'e for a longer period of time. So in summary, our program's worked with 16 different endemic species that we hatched and raised at our facilities. We've had more than 4,000 eggs laid or harvested, and we've hatched close to over 1,400 chicks with a pretty high hatchability rate. So a big part of that is, in the past, we were doing lots of artificial incubation. The eggs were being checked daily. They were weighed daily, closely monitored for any defectiveness that we identified in the egg. Of those chicks that hatched, 1,127 birds successfully fledged. And a big part of that was coming back to the hand rearing success, where we could closely monitor the birds and make sure that they were getting the resources that we need. And to date, we've released 847 birds of the different species that I've mentioned back into different habitats throughout all of the Hawaiian Islands. So thank you.